So I feel a little guilty about today's episode for two reasons. One, the day I'm recording this is February 27, 2025. And we are all living through a successful Russian psyop. The Steele dossier is real. If you forget what the Steele dossier is, that's Christopher Steele. He was the British spy who shared intelligence with America that suggested that the Russians have compromise on Donald Trump. And, I don't care what people say about Russia hoax, Russiagate, all that bullshit. It's true. We're living through it in the moment. Just within the last day or so, the U.S. voted against a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They're about to drop sanctions. They're negotiating without the Ukrainians. Tulsi Gabbard is director of national intelligence. Kash Patel is the director of the FBI. Dan Bongino is the assistant director of the FBI, et cetera, so on and so forth. So that's what's most pressing. And I feel like, if I could, ring the alarm bells, that would be what I should be doing at this moment. Not something as self-indulgent as taking on the hard problem of consciousness. The second reason that I feel guilty about this is because, I find myself beating up on Sam Harris sometimes. And I really like Sam Harris. I wish he were the standard, the gold standard of the internet. I wish he were sort of the starting point for the intellectual discourse in America and on the internet and globally as well. I, by and large, very much agree with Sam Harris, and I really appreciate his willingness to call out MAGA and to call out woke. This is what we need, people who can chew gum and walk at the same time. And this is what we're sorely lacking. Everybody's got audience capture. Everybody's captured by the algorithm, and they're just ringing whatever bell gets them the most clicks, the most likes, whatever, instead of, being willing to be balanced. So I just want to say at the outset that I really respect Sam Harris for his ability to call out truth and error on both sides. However, I do have disagreements with him, and I've pushed back on him in the past regarding his stance on free will and determinism. And I actually think that he's doing a huge disservice, and apparently doesn't even recognize that. There's a big think clip of him out there. It's on the meaning crisis. And he even says at one point, we have a choice. And this is coming from somebody who argues that we have no choice. And I think the heart of the meaning crisis would be all these very damaging philosophies that are going around claiming that we have no free will, that we might live in a simulation, that we're not in touch with reality. I mean, those are great things to think about. And of course, people have the right to, have opinions. And, I'm not arguing any of that. But when public intellectuals like Sam Harris say to the public on a program like Joe Rogan, where you have a bunch of high bros out there who think they can see through the matrix, and there's no free will, and that really has a downstream cultural effect. The late philosopher Daniel Dennett called out Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky for committing high-class social vandalism, and I agree. And I thought that was ironic because I thought everything that Daniel Dennett did in his career was high-class social vandalism. I disagree with Daniel Dennett big time. I was shocked to find towards the end of his life that he was a free will proponent, but he takes this bullshit position, which is known as compatibilism, which somehow you square absolute determinism and materialism with something that would have to transcend that, which is free will. And you say that there's some compatible list mechanism in between, which just doesn't make sense from either side. It's a cop out. But I came across this about a half hour clip. I'm going to react to it and add my 2 cents. I will make cuts because obviously a half hour clip is already too long. And with, if it were the full half hour plus my comments, it would be too much. So you'll see, I'll just go through and judiciously, make jump cuts. But I think Sam Harris does a great job of explicating what the hard problem of consciousness is. And I just found listening to it that there are places I feel like I can interject and show where the conversation could go, things that he's missing, assumptions that he's making. And it just seemed like, a way to do that. It's just sort of a matrix for me to add my thoughts in about consciousness. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to play the whole clip, sit here and make those comments, and then I'll go back through and edit it down for brevity.
Well, so it depends on what the solution is. So the hard problem is that, and this comes to us courtesy of the philosopher David Chalmers, who coined the phrase. He pointed out that there are all the quote easy problems of understanding the mind, which is just you can understand how, for instance, with vision, there's light that comes in and hits the retina and gets so you have electromagnetic energy that gets transformed into electrochemical energy in the nervous system. You have a series of neuronal firings as a result of light hitting the retina. And that gets encoded in visual cortex in various patterns. And there's what's called a retinotopic mapping of the visual scene on visual cortex. And there's certain cells that are responsive to lines at a certain angle. And we've come to understand all of this. It's very complicated, but nothing in principle is profoundly counterintuitive. And every step along the way, we can understand what light is doing to specific molecules in the retina, how those molecules affect downstream neuronal firing, and then what happens, how neurons function physically, chemically, electrochemically.
Okay, so something that I want to say here is what he's taking for granted scientifically, because I haven't heard him speak specifically about evolution, but I'm just going to assume that he takes evolution at face value. He takes evolution the way that Richard Dawkins would take evolution. And so what he's glossing over here is what's glossed over all the time, which is this amazing, yes, it's mechanistic. So what he's saying is we can understand how the light hits the retina, that light energy is translated, transformed into, biochemical energy, how it travels the optic nerve to the visual centers in the back of the brain, how that's distributed out, how there are these, what was he saying that based on the polarization or based on the point is, what we're already overlooking is this extraordinary complexity that even if the body and even if finally consciousness itself is all one mechanism, the fact of that mechanism itself transcends what we understand about science, even though somebody like Sam Harris would say, oh, no, that's covered in evolution. Darwin explained that. And no, Darwin did not explain that. So I push back on evolution all the time. And the thing to understand about the argument over evolution and the arguments that scientists like Sam Harris would make for it is that they start out immediately by conflating what they mean by evolution. So if somebody like Sam Harris, and I'm sure, the vast majority of people, who are listening to this would say, what do you mean evolution is proven? That's a conflation. The fact that things evolve, that there's something like evolution, that life starts out as single-celled organisms, becomes multicellular organisms, and then essentially in the blink of an eye, in the Cambrian explosion, animals show up. That conservation of material, the fact that, cells become multicellular and become animals, that it builds on itself, that it changes over time, and that it gains complexity and power. Yes, that's been proven. The fact that things evolve has been proven. The question of how things evolve is pure conjecture. And the problem with the Darwinian mechanism, evolution by natural selection being sufficient in and of itself to give rise to complexity, is a mathematical non-starter from the beginning. And in past episodes, I have argued this, and people routinely don't get it, which is that evolution is such a weak theory in terms of the explanation of how complexity arises, not that it arises and that it evolves, something you could call evolution, the process of a consistent gaining in complexity. That things evolve has been proven. How they evolve has not. And the problem with the neo-Darwinian explanation is that it's a mathematical non-starter from the beginning, and that they never put any math to it. So, what do I mean that there's no math behind evolution? Well, what's the mutational space? Right? There's a mutational space, which is exactly everything that has ever lived or died on the planet. That creates a mutational space that is alleged to be sufficient to bring about the visual system, the brain, and then the consciousness itself of what's being seen. And he just walked through very roughly all these steps that light has to take to be transformed into your conscious perception of it. And yes, along the way, what he's saying is we can see the mechanism, but what's being overlooked, and this is really huge, and I don't think people realize what a blindness this is. How did that incredibly complex system arise? And, people say, oh, well, it's, random mutation and natural selection. And then again, it's like, okay, what do you mean by that? Could you put some mathematical definition on that? And it's always lacking. So the first step is, what is the size of the mutational space? Everything that has ever lived, from single-celled organisms to dinosaurs to you and I, every individual being that has ever lived creates a mutational space. Roughly speaking, that mutational space is 10 to the 40th. So a 10 followed by 40 zeros. And you would say, well, that's an extraordinary large number. It is, but it's one of those things relative to what, right? It's a huge number. But is 10 to the 40th sufficient for bringing about the visual system that he just roughly sketched? No, it's not. And it's so insufficient that anybody with any, rationality and intelligence, such as Sam Harris, should see that. Again, this is where the evolutionist, Richard Dawkins, you can read his book, The Blind Watchmaker. It's all analogy. It's all metaphor. It's all conjecture. He never puts any real numbers to the process. So the mutational space is 10 to the 40th. Here's the problem. A functional protein, genetics codes for functional proteins. Functional proteins, DNA is two-dimensional. Functional proteins are three-dimensional. They're proteins, they have to fold in three-dimensional space, and they have to be a very specific form. They have to be a very specific shape to successfully, do their job. For every functional protein, a functional protein is 1 in 10 to the 77th. So 10 to the 40th, 10 with 40 zeros is a really big number, but a 10 with 77 zeros is exponentially larger than 10 to the 40th. It's another 10 times 37. So you add, 10 to the 40th is the mutational space. If a functional protein were 10 to the 41st, 10 to the 40th would be 10 times too small. And every zero you add on that is 10 times bigger than the number before it, 10 times the number bigger before that. So to get a functional protein, you need 10 to the 77th tries to get that functional protein. The simplest cell is composed of 30 individual proteins. So that's 10 to the 1 and 10 to the 77th coming in 30 times just to get the proteins you need. And then whatever the odds are of getting those 30 proteins arranged in a way that they create a functional cell. So from the beginning, we know that evolution by natural selection is a statistical non-starter because all of the individual life forms that have ever existed, which creates the mutational space, is woefully insufficient to get you even one functional protein, let alone the 30 you need for the simplest cell, let alone the configuration of those cells that you would need to come together to create that cell, such that the simplest cell could not be produced if every atom in the known universe were participating in the mutational space, let alone the woefully insufficient amount of material that you have to work with on planet Earth. And so already there's this buy-in that scientists like Sam Harris make, where they're assuming that even the mechanism itself, if it's all mechanistic, beginning to end, front to back, if consciousness itself becomes mechanistic, there's no way that you could allow that or assign that to anything that looks like the random process that is the evolutionary mechanism. And so already we're overlooking the fact that evolution itself is intelligently directed. And so people say, well, that's intelligent design. And yes, that's intelligent design. That doesn't mean that that intelligence is some god with a beard, wearing a robe and sandals, and likes to write on stone for some odd reason. It would just simply mean that the ontological primitive of the universe itself requires that the universe be intelligent. The original question that you can ask is, why is there anything and not nothing? Nobody can answer that question. The second question you can ask is, what then does exist? And all you would have to say is that intelligence itself exists from the start. And it blows my mind that people as intelligent as Sam Harris will look at the absolute mind-blowing complexity of the mechanism itself and not see that the mechanism could only have come into being through an intelligent process. And we always know intelligent action by its violation of the background random noise. If you were flying in a plane over, a deserted island archipelago, somewhere in the South Pacific, and you were to see on a beach the word help scrawled out in the sand, you would know that somebody down there is trying to get your attention. You would know that that is an intentional act. Why? Because all the beaches in all the universe, right? There are other planets out there that have, liquid water and sand and, you know, you get what I'm saying. It's all the beaches in all the world, all the beaches in all the universe would never, with the ebb and flow of the tides, scrawl the word help into the sand. And you know that that is intentional by the violation of the background randomness. So to me, this is where you can, the argument for evolution, neo-Darwinism, begins and ends because the mathematics of coincidence is exponential. The mathematics of just flipping a coin, if you were to, hand out a coin to, every grain of sand on the planet and have them flip a coin, you would never get 1,000 heads in a row because every time you flip that coin, you get a head. Each one time it's a 50-50 chance, but to get two heads in a row, it's 1 in 4. To get three heads in a row, it's 1 in 8. And as that goes up, that's an exponential increase in the odds that you will get to your desired outcome, which would be 1,000 heads in a row. And that's just with 50-50 chances. When you're dealing with the extraordinary unlikelihood of everything that you would need to stack up to get the lens of the eye to be made from exactly the right material, to be exactly the right shape, to focus the light rays exactly on the back of the eye, to the rods and the cones, to all the complex bio, chemical and biomechanical processes that lead to the nerve transmissions to be processed by the brain to then become a product in your consciousness. Each one of those steps isn't adding to the complexity, it's multiplying the complexity. It's not adding to the unlikelihood, it's multiplying to the unlikelihood. And that is a exponential process that always exhausts the possibilities of the mutational space. So already he has, just with the mechanistic argument, leapfrogged over all of that.
How genetic, encoding of protein relates to all of that, receptors and neurotransmitters. Like there's just it's clockwork at bottom. It's wet, it's messy, it's complicated, but it is really.
It's clockwork, it's wet, it's messy, it's complicated, but he hasn't put a mathematical definition on the clockwork, a mathematical definition on the complexity. It's so clockwork and it's so complex that the mutational space simply could never offer it up.
Our intuitions run all the way through as you drill down on the micro of details. There are no surprises. Like the causality makes sense all the way through. What doesn't make sense at all, and what is profoundly counterintuitive, is that at some point along the way, there's something that it's like to see, right? Like we could imagine building a robot on the principles of our visual system, and having it visually navigate the world based on visual data, but have it effectively be unconscious. There'd be nothing that it's like to be that robot. That robot would not experience vision in any way, all the while performing functionally in the world as a system that's making use of visual data.
But if you were to see that robot, you would know beyond a doubt that that robot is the product of intentional design.
In our case, we have the full pyrotechnics of conscious life. We have the conscious experience of vision, and that is fundamentally mysterious. There's no description of the micro events that makes the emergence of conscious vision perspicuous, understandable.
And yet, not only would the mutational space, not only would the neo-Darwinian mechanism have to explain the mechanism, have figured out the mechanism, but it would also figure out this mystery that he'll go on to say we'll never understand.
And what's worse, and the reason why this is really truly the hard problem as opposed to just yet another easy problem that we may one day solve, is that it seems impossible to imagine what could be an explanation that would intuitively run through. It's like you can't say, oh, but if only neurons were firing at this frequency, well then, okay, then I understand why there's something that it's like to see, right? No frequency it seems even relevant, right? It's like it simply does not matter what frequency it is, or how many neurons you get, or what their pattern of connectivity is, or what neurotransmitters are involved, or none of that matters. Like that, all of that is as strange as saying that, if a wind blows across a trailer park at exactly 146 miles an hour, and the trailer park is filled with watermelons and beer, that whole system becomes conscious, becomes a conscious mind. There's something that it's like to be a trailer park, right? But
this is interesting too, because Sam Harris talks about artificial intelligence. And I did a video on one of the podcasts that he did on that. Excuse me. And he says at one point, he says, we now know that intelligence is substrate independent, meaning that intelligence can be encoded in the substrate of your brain and your neurons, or intelligence can be coded into, electric ones and zeros, computers. And I found that, I had one of those aha moments, and I said, no. Intelligence is not substrate independent. Intelligence is substrate infinite. You need a ground infinity. This is why none of these materialist scientists can crack this nut, because they're always trying to instantiate the phenomenon in a finite substrate. And he's actually getting to the the analogy or the principle that will always let you know that computers will never be conscious. What he's saying is, why would this random movement of trailer parks and beer cans and watermelons with a certain wind speed come to, like, how would that make sense? And that's no different than, the mechanisms that we're made of. Why would, neurons firing at a certain frequency all of a sudden give rise to consciousness? The reason why you will know that artificial intelligence will never work, and why indeed intelligence isn't substrate independent, it's substrate infinite, is because if we're saying that a computer is intelligent, essentially what we're saying is because we have some mathematics, some mathematical pattern among the electric ones and zeros in the microprocessor, in the RAM, that has been attained, and that math is intelligent. That mathematical pattern, that equation is intelligent. The problem with that is that math is substrate independent. And you can instantiate your math in electric ones and zeros, and with the microprocessor, move those ones and zeros around incredibly fast. But you can also take that math and instantiate it in a field of beer cans. This is factually true. You can take a huge field of beer cans and have the beer cans standing up be your ones and the beer cans laying on their side be your zeros. And you can take ChatGPT. It's very slow and it would be very hard to do, but in principle, it is factually correct that whatever the mathematical reality of your AI is, you can translate that into a field of beer cans. You can do math in any substrate. You can do math on an abacus. You can do math with beans. You can do math with stones, whatever it is that you want to do. But you would never look at the mathematical code of ChatGPT in a field of beer cans and say that that field of beer cans is conscious. Therefore, why would you say that just because ChatGPT is instantiated in electric ones and zeros that move faster than the beer cans, does it have something to do with speed? No, it's still just ones and zeros. It takes a one, it takes a conscious one to bring the meaning to just to establish from the start that the ones are the beer cans standing up and the zeros are the beer cans on their side. If you don't know that, you can't see the pattern. So what is it that imposes the pattern, right? You're watching this on a screen. The screen is just pixels. The pixels in and of themselves have no meaning. When you look away, the meaning of the screen disappears. But when you look at it, it's not that you're making, that's the mistake. You're not all of a sudden creating the computer like Donald Hoffman would have you believe. But what you are doing is bringing the seed of meaning and the ability to bind all those pixels together into a singular experience that's then giving the meaning. And so he's actually right here talking about the beer can problem. If consciousness is a mathematical equation, then a field of beer cans can be conscious. But a field of beer cans can't be conscious. Therefore, a mathematical equation can't be conscious either.
You take away the watermelon, it's not conscious anymore, right? It's a mere statement of a miracle, right? And that's what it seems like it would be.
And that's the point. It is a miracle. And I know that, you think, oh, Bible thumping, whatever. No, I'm not. I'm actually, as wide as I am, more of a Hindu at this point than anything else. It just means that there is this transcendent reality. There's this transcendent phenomena that is not in and of itself explicable by material means and cannot be instantiated into finite substrates, that is bringing the meaning. And without that meaning, you can never decode what the meaning is in a finite local structure.
Would be happening in the case of any story about the wheelworks of neurophysiology. So the hard problem is if consciousness emerges on the basis of unconscious complexity. First you have unconscious information processing. First you have unconscious molecules, chemicals bouncing around. But that at a certain point of integration, at a certain point of encoding, the lights come on, right? If that's the way things work, those of us who are enamored of the hard problem would say it's always going to seem like a miracle, right? Like it's like that's not understandable. That's the equivalent of saying before the Big Bang there was truly nothing, and then everything exploded into being, right? Like there's not just that there was nothing, there was no heat and no energy and no matter. There were no laws of nature either. There was like nothing. But then in a certain moment, everything appeared, including the laws of nature by which anything would further appear, right? Okay, that if you believe that, as Terence McKenna once said, if you can believe that, you can believe anything. Like that, it seems to be the limit case for extreme credulity. I think is what he said, right? So like that is the hardest thing possible to believe because nothing is real nothing, not just not having space time, but like nothing, not having laws of nature, not having anything, right? Real nothing is precisely what can't give rise to something, let alone everything. Analogously, true unconsciousness, true nothing that it's like to be, this system, is precisely the thing that can't give rise to the something of consciousness, right? And so it doesn't matter how you order it. It doesn't matter. It just, it's not going to be intelligible. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't true, right? So I'm willing to say that it could just be a fact that neurons in a certain configuration give rise to consciousness. And if you change the configuration slightly, there's nothing that it's like to be that set of neurons, right? So consciousness could truly be an emergent property of unconscious complexity, and I'm just not capable of understanding how. It's just it's just a brute fact, right? And okay, so that's just, we would have to acknowledge that that is a condition in which we don't actually have a normal scientific explanation. Like our scientific explanation of,
And I think what he's getting around, what's underneath, what he's playing around with here is this problem that the initial question that we could ask, which is why is there anything and not nothing, is unanswerable. And I just find that as a really important philosophical and ontological touchstone, epistemological, whatever you want to say. And it's fascinating to me, and I guess that's why I spend so much time with these philosophical thoughts, is because it's a way of making philosophy alive. Like you can run that thought experiment for yourself. Why is there anything and not nothing? And it's just unanswerable. You can't, because you can always ask why that, why that, why that. One of the clarifications that I would like to offer as somebody on the outside is that the next step is to ask, since things exist, since there is existence itself, just there's the idea of existence itself, there's the experience of existence itself, regardless of what exists. And I would say that would perhaps take consciousness and make consciousness initial and fundamental, because existence and consciousness are two words for the same thing. The question is then, what exists? Why things exist can never be explained, but we can go about cataloging what exists. And I think the fundamental error of science and the fundamental error of the Western analytical approach, and scientists who unknowingly participate in scientism, is that they have biases without evidence about what can exist. Everything is, in some real sense, as unlikely as anything else. That doesn't mean that everything exists, right? That's where Daniel Dennett brought in the whole flying spaghetti monster. Well, what if I told you that this was the flying spaghetti monster? That's ridiculous. Okay, fine. But we can go about looking around and seeing, is there any real compelling evidence for the flying spaghetti monster? And there's not. But there is real compelling evidence for consciousness being fundamental and for its activity being that which we call intelligence. And then when we look at the hyper complexity, indistinguishable from divine, that makes our bodies. I mean, you wanna believe in some God, you want to believe in some creative force. Just pick up a book of anatomy and physiology and see how you're put together. See how little you know about your own body, and really begin to understand how all of these structures within your body are woven together perfectly to create just your ability to move around in three-dimensional space. And begin to ask yourself, how could this possibly have come into existence in some blind fashion in the 10 to the 40th mutational space that is every organism that's ever lived or died on this planet? And 10 to the 40th, again, is a big number, but it's not, infinite, and it's not, 10 to the 77th, which is what you would need to just get one functional protein. And then you will see that the hallmark of intelligence is the violation of the background probability. The hallmark of intelligence is the violation of, it's the mathematics of coincidence. Again, I could ask you, what are the chances that out of, 7 billion people on the planet, you see my face on this video and you go, well, that's absurd. I'm going to see some face, right? The fact that you see my face isn't coincidental at this point, it's incidental. If you were to bump into me at the store tomorrow, that would be coincidental. It would be coincident of my face. You would have seen me on YouTube and then seen me at the store, and you'd go, oh my God, what are the chances of that? But even that we could say is just incidental. You just happened to bump into me. But if you were to bump into me at work, and then you were to bump into me at the movie theater, and then you were to bump into me at your driveway, you would start to begin to believe that chance had nothing to do with it and that it's intelligent, because the chances of all those coincidences coming together become exponential. And then you would be well within your rights and your sane mind to accuse me of, stalking you or whatever. That's the mathematics of coincidence. And every time you add another layer of coincidence, every time a new set of events describes the same thing, you are taking an exponential step in the improbability of that being chance and the probability of that being meaningful, being intentional. And so I think the huge blindness here in science and what I would argue is scientism is this bias of the second step. First step being, why is there anything and not nothing at all? The first question you can ask can't be answered. Second question asked is, what exists? And so from the start, what I'm saying is that consciousness exists from the start and therefore intentionality, because consciousness and intentionality describe the same thing.
Of life is truly a reduction that works. And it's like it used to be that people thought there was a profound mystery between distinguishing living and non-living objects, right? So like there's a living system like an animal and a non-living system like a machine, and there must be some life force that explains this difference. Now, if you leave consciousness aside, right, and you're actually just talking about the how we define life and just what a system has to be to qualify as living, how it metabolizes energy and reproduces, and I mean, like the definition of life is a little fuzzy at the boundaries, but for instance, it's not entirely clear whether it applies to something like a virus, say, but it's a semantic judgment as to whether it would. But once you define your terms and you understand something like the molecular basis of inheritance, just how DNA works and how cells divide and how gametes form and get together, and how it's like there is no more to the mystery. Like we now know how babies get made, and we know how we pass on our genes, and we know why kids resemble their parents, and the biology of inheritance is, again, it's very complex. There's still things we don't totally understand about it, but there are no real mysteries, right? Like it is a concatenation of physical facts that when you drill down far enough, it's amazing, but it's not confounding, right?
Yeah.
But add consciousness to this picture, there's no place for it. Like there's no evidence of consciousness in the universe apart from our direct experience of it. And there's no indication that it would exist or should exist apart from our direct experience of it. And yet our direct experience of it is the only thing really that we can be certain of, right? It's like, so far be it that there's some imbecilic statements that occasionally come out of philosophy and neuroscience that suggest that consciousness might be an illusion, right? Consciousness is the one thing in this universe that simply cannot be an illusion, right? Because it is the thing that would give rise to any possible illusion, right? Like if
No, I agree with him here 100%. Um, I think he's spot on, and I think that later he's like at a height here with that, and then he's going to degrade consciousness as we go down, and we talk about panpsychism and integrated information theory and all these other things, and forget that when we're talking about consciousness, all we know of that term is our own experience of it. And part of the reason why this conversation then goes in a million different directions is because we lose sight of the fact that we only know our own consciousness, that everything we know is within that consciousness, that it is totally unexplainable. It is even, in a real sense, undefinable. Like there's really even, it's not just that we can't explain how consciousness arises, we essentially can't even define it. But then people will go handing it out like it's Halloween candy to everything. And that will get into later, this mistake that we make thinking that consciousness is simple awareness and that awareness is something like a reflection, when it's, so much more than that.
even if you are completely confused about what reality is, even if you're in the matrix, right, or this is all a simulation, on in some alien supercomputer, or you're a brain in a vat, or you're psychotic, and I mean, you could be confused about everything. You can't be confused that something seems to be happening. Right? That
100%.
seeming is what we mean by consciousness.
100%.
So, semi-paradoxically, though we don't understand it, we don't understand how it arises, or even at bottom whether it does in fact arise. I mean, it could be a more fundamental constituent of the universe, though I'm not sure what I believe about that. Though we don't understand it, and we don't understand its place in nature, we can understand that it's the one thing we are absolutely certain of in each moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's the one thing about us that participates in the fact of existence itself. So that's how huge, how enormous consciousness is. Consciousness is everything that you can describe about everything. Consciousness is the fact of things. Like, again, you just assume that we're the only life in the universe, just for argument's sake, and that we can look back at the archaeological record and see, the traces, the fossilized traces of, the first single-celled organisms. And he was talking about life and consciousness as the two are different, which I find fascinating because I just feel like it's everybody's instinctual knowledge that life and anything that's alive is conscious at some level. But the overarchingness of consciousness, this thing that anesthesia can turn on and off, at least as far as the local body is concerned. Existence doesn't take place in your elbow. Existence doesn't take place in your earlobe. These are things in the body that you can point to and you can describe. But the fact of your consciousness itself is the substrate of all knowledge and all knowing, of all characteristics, of all descriptions of the universe itself, has to take place in consciousness. So that's how large your local consciousness is, which then later, panpsychists will dole out to every atom in the universe, and, integrated information theorists, which is essentially just, one of many flavors of materialism, will dole out to some finite mathematical structure.
The basis upon which any further certainty would be granted to us about anything. I mean, it is our conscious life that is the it's the only condition in which we do science, in which we think about eternal truths of mathematics or anything else. I mean, it's like
it's all of mathematics,
all of cognition. Effectively, even though we understand that in our case it very likely has unconscious precursors, right? I mean, they're cognitive operations. There's a lot to our mental lives that seems to be happening.
I think he gets confused here with conscious of, unconscious of, and consciousness itself. What we're self-conscious of, reflective on, focused on, versus, man, and this is, where it goes down some really esoteric alleys that are relevant to the conversation in a very factual way, but almost no one has the grasp on. So at a certain point in my early 20s, I learned what esoteric means. And of course, I'm going to give a really, a bad definition of it at this point. But esoteric is this lived experience of the mystery of the phenomenon itself. So esoteric knowledge is knowledge that you can only gain if you've had the deep, meaningful experience. Man, and there was so what I would argue is that right there's a way where the plot gets lost, where he's talking about, well, there are conscious processes and there are unconscious processes that, feed those conscious processes, and the conscious and subconscious, Freudian, all that stuff. I would argue that no, in your conscious experience, you are actually in touch with the whole of it. And that, yes, somehow that gets constrained down, focused down, filtered down to what you would say I have a conscious experience of or an unconscious experience of, I have knowledge of or I don't have knowledge of. But there's still a way that even in this conscious moment, in your awareness of, is instantly and immediately bound to consciousness of all things, in a way that is, it's so relevant, but such an esoteric and distant experience to have. That these dichotomies that he makes between conscious of and unconscious of are different from consciousness with a capital C.
Happening in the dark. But anything that we can actually notice and talk about and directly experience is by definition something that's happening in consciousness.
That was so fascinating for me as a listener, just aside from being the host of this show, which I now need to continue on with being. So if you had to give your answer, would you say it's then consciousness, awareness,
Oh, yeah, so I didn't give you the time capsule answer after all that rigmarole. I did not give you the answer. So my answer is just that there's two possibilities. If it emerges from unconscious complexity at some level, that may be true. That may actually be the right answer. If that's true, I think we will never understand that in the way we want to understand any other thing. It's like there are things we understand. We really do understand them, and that will not be one of those things. Again, we understand how DNA works, at least to a first approximation, right? We understand how it's like if you shatter a window, we understand why it shatters and why it doesn't just melt, right? Like because we understand about the lattice structure of the molecules, right? It's like brittleness at the higher level is the thing you would expect to emerge given the way the atoms in that substance are arranged. And so it is with the wetness of water, right? Like it's like there are emergent properties, but yet they're understandable. Consciousness is not that sort of emergent property. So if this is in fact true in 100 years, if we just if, the aliens land and tell us this is how consciousness arises, it's exactly this kind of unconscious processing that gives it, that turns the lights on, and look, we turn the dial a little bit and the lights go out and then they're back on, they're out, you can play with this dial as much as you want. And you'll notice that it's just this is exactly what consciousness is in any physical system. Okay, that's amazing. That's a miracle. We don't understand it, but we can then live on that basis. We could design conscious computers on that basis, right? Like we could design, as I think we would want to, unconscious computers that can't suffer and can't be happy. And when you turn them off, you're not murdering them, right? Because there's nothing that it's like to be those computers.
And okay, so here this may be a field too far, but in earlier episodes, I was working with this idea that what you and I are is constrained infinities. Just entertain for a moment the possibility that something can be on one side of it infinite and then on the other side of it finite. So one side of it non-local and the other side local. And so what's happening in this conversation, like even the host said, well, I have to get back to being the host of this show, meaning I have to take all of this complexity and put it through the lens of the idea of being a host. And Sam is talking about those things we understand, the brittleness of, I forget what, but, glass, crystals, the wetness of water. Our understanding then is a constraint on the ground infinity that is the consciousness that is our ground. And so there's this way then that there's this infinite ground, which is consciousness itself, which would be what the Upanishads, the Vedas, call the self with a capital S, that constrains itself down to individual experiences and lenses in local space and in finite matter. And so there's this shift from all-pervading infinite consciousness to our individual experiences. And the thing I think is getting missed is the shift from consciousness itself as being the necessity for anything to have existence, consciousness itself as being synonymous with existence, and then what can exist and how an experience can be had through the constraints. There is a mathematics of infinity that allows for different orders of infinity. I would argue that those different orders of infinity are brought into being by constraints on infinity. How is it that you could constrain the unconstrainable? Well, hey, I can only go so far. These are, just ideas. But I think the reason why materialists at root, the reason why mathematicians at root, the reason why AI will never be truly conscious at root is because these things are always the finite constraints and they're not the infinite substrate that's being constrained.
We cannot make the mistake of accidentally building conscious computers because now we understand that consciousness is, the way the lights go on is this way, and we can decide when we do that. But I think it's more likely that we will, in the near term, far before we actually think we understand the true neural correlates of consciousness, I think we'll build computers that we think are conscious because they just seem to be conscious. And we might build them in such a way where they claim to be conscious. but those of us who understand the heart problem won't know. You know, it'll just be it'll fundamentally be mysterious as to whether they're conscious, and yet will helplessly relate to them as though they are conscious because it'll seem psychopathic not to. I mean, especially if you build anything like a humanoid robot that really has appropriate facial expressions and tones of voice and is obviously passing the Turing test because it's smarter than you are, and it's, you know, it's totally aware of your emotions, and it's seems to have emotions of its own because it's been built that way, and you'll helplessly feel like you're in relationship to another conscious being, and I think most of us will just lose sight of whether the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness was ever an interesting problem. We just won't know, you know, and we'll forget about it.
Yeah. So I'm asking you to speak.
I think he's actually wrong there on his prediction. And the prediction is just relevant because it's describing the 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 problem that we're dealing with. I think that if we're very careful and very observant as we build AIs in greater and greater complexity, we will learn more and more about what it actually means to be conscious. We will constantly be catching AI in its limits. We'll constantly be catching Android in their limits. That's only something that a non-conscious entity would do. And so this assumption that we'll get to a point where the distinction will seem uninteresting and irrelevant, I don't think we'll ever actually reach. And I think that if we can use AI to understand to get a finer understanding of what meaning and intentionality really is. And I guess that would just get to my final point, which is the cultural implications of these conversations, if we could, instead of endlessly debating them, really make the hard and correct decisions about what's true and false, would lead us to seeing what's always been right before our eyes. And this is, again, it's gonna sound religious and whatever. Let it be religious. But we are divine creations of an infinite substrate, which is synonymous with existence itself, and which is so intelligent that it gave us our bodies, that we, as local individual beings, have no idea how they work. You have hundreds and hundreds of defined muscle groups in your body. When you get up out of a chair and walk, you don't know which one of those hundreds of muscle groups you're firing first. You don't know how they orchestrate together to get you around the room. Just to give you an idea of how little you actually know about the mechanism of your own body. And so instead of seeing that as some random occurrence, seeing that as intentional, and then instead of seeing you and I as some product of the finite firing of our neurons, but understanding that that self, that consciousness, is an infinite substrate. Imagine if we all had that agreement, what that would do for the way that we would relate to each other in the world. And maybe it would be overwhelming. Maybe we always have to tone things down. That was one of the things that my experience with psychedelics made me think was, you get high enough and you have all these amazing thoughts and whatever. And it's unfortunate because there's a lot of real reality and goodness to the psychedelic experience that then gets lost because when we come back to our sober minds, we just have to laugh at it because we can't carry that weight. But it made me think, what is the sober default? Where does soberness come from? Like, why is it that the mind and the brain is constructed in a way that makes, reality mundane? And it must only be because if it weren't, we couldn't get on with life. And again, this is the problem with esotericism. This is a problem with esoteric knowledge, and that's what's actually relevant, is it takes a deep experience of the meaning from the first person to even know what the truth is, and that just, you know, that just apparently is only relevant to the individual and is nearly impossible to scale on a societal level. But we all carry the same inner workings and the same questions, which is why cults persist. The fact of being is so strange that it has deep psychological power, and there's this deep yearning in everybody for those answers. And I think that's one of the reasons why cults persist, is because they speak to that, but we don't have a common language to understand that. And that actually reminds me of something that Sam Harris said in another platform, where he's talking about the problem of religion, and he thinks that religion is, a negative force, and he's faced with the fact that the greatest atrocities of the 20th century were committed by, a religious institutions, the fascists, the communists, Mao's China, roughly, the Nazis, the USSR, and Maoist China. These were all atheist movements. And he says, well, those are forms of religion. Well, he's the mistake he's making there then is not understanding the deep import and psychological need for religion. He's not understanding that we walk around in bodies that need explanation, and evolution just isn't it. And we walk around with these the ability, the fact of consciousness, and it is this perpetual, he's used the terms, it seems like a miracle, and it always seemed to be a mystery. Take seem out of those, and it is a miracle, and it will always be a mystery. That is what it is at root. And so he's trying to deny religion and not understanding the fundamental psychological power that demands religion. And so all he's saying is, well, if everybody just used common sense, but you're denying the need that gives rise to religion. And so you're not giving the problem of religion enough import and enough thought.
Into some obvious unknowns here, right? So you said, you would say, essentially, to boil it down, your best guess is that it's probably unconscious complexity, if you had to put it.
So the alternative to that is that no, it doesn't in fact emerge. It goes all the way down into the most basic constituents of matter, or this opposition between matter and consciousness is at bottom misconceived, and there's some, the technical phrase for this in philosophy is neutral monism. I think it was Bertrand Russell who gave us this phrase, but there's some neutral position conceptually from which to understand mind and matter that doesn't admit of this dualism. So it's like currently it just seems like there's a mystery. There's the physics of things, and then there's mind and consciousness. But now even it's mind without consciousness isn't even all that mysterious. So it's really just there's physics that's unconscious, and then there's consciousness, and we don't know how to marry them. We don't know how.
There's physics, and physics itself theoretically may go on, like the universe, they say, may be infinite. There may be an infinite number of universes. But when you're doing physics, you're always doing physics locally. You always have to draw a line, a circle around something, and say, I'm only doing the physics within the circle. So you have to make it local and finite. And so what he's saying is that there's this physics, and then there's this consciousness. And the clarification I would say here is that there's this finitude, there's this finite, there's this limit, which is where we do physics and where we do math, right? Math, the numbers, the integers are infinite, but we always constrain them down to a finite local set of numbers that we can work with. So we're always, when we're doing math, doing it finitely and locally. And so it's this duality of the finite and the infinite, if that makes sense. And what I'm trying to argue is that the reason why consciousness will always elude our science is that science is ultimately always finite and always local. And what we're dealing with is, as conscious beings, we are constrained infinities. Somehow, infinity is so large that it's able to constrain itself. And that's the reason why. I think that's what Gödel's incompleteness theorems point to.
Where consciousness comes into the picture. Well, let's just say it doesn't come into the picture. Let's say it goes all the way down. Let's say that there's something that it's like to be an electron on some level, right? It doesn't mean that electron is thinking. It doesn't mean that it uses language. But like there's some interior dimension to everything that we would.
Okay, so I think this is actually where I'll just wrap it up instead of doing jump cuts. But if you'll remember, I said before that, he was spot on about, consciousness is actually the only thing that you can be sure of, which is why it's absurd to say that consciousness is illusion, because an illusion would be having to be the substrate for its own illusion. And how your consciousness is the only consciousness that that you have direct contact to, and how enormous that is since it participates in the mere fact of existence itself. And now we've gone from, the size of you and I and, all the truths in philosophy and mathematics that our consciousness can house. And now we're doling that out to what it's like to be an electron. And I think that the mistake that's being made here across the board in consciousness studies is that when we start to dole out consciousness to the electron, and the electron may be conscious, I'm not, saying that that's not a possibility. But what I'm saying is we can only do that if we take this idea that to be conscious is to be aware, and to be aware is simply to reflect. And so it's like taking a huge mirror and shattering it down to the smallest possible shard of that mirror and saying, well, that shard of that mirror can fit within an electron, and that mirror then can reflect reality, and that's what awareness is. And so just to be consciousness is somehow just to reflect the factness of things. I think that's a huge mistake. I think if an electron has consciousness, then an electron has the need of the whole philosophical paradigm, that it has the need to explain itself. It has its need to explain what the root of meaning is. It has a want. It has an intention. It has all these things. So we have to be extraordinarily mindful that when we start doling out individual consciousness to all and everything, that no matter how much you shrink that consciousness down, it still requires an entire team of French philosophers to just deal with the fact of its existence itself. And that would be a very strange thing for a single electron to have. So anyways, I know this sounds incredibly random, and maybe somebody out there somewhere, this has found something, it feels so Sisyphean, it feels so quixotic to do videos like this. But I just wanted to chime in on the conversation because, here's Sam Harris, who, there's Sam Harris, the person, and then there's Sam Harris as he sort of interfaces with culture and the need that he uh, suffices the role that he plays. And there are these things from the outset that he's completely overlooking, which is even if we were just a mechanism, the mutational space of the planet Earth is woefully insufficient to assign the power to create the mechanism. There's just not enough chance in the system to call it chance. And so, if there's not enough chance in the system, if the entire mutational space couldn't even produce one functional protein, let alone the billions of functional proteins and their configuration that it would take to create you and I, you have that violation of the background probability that can only be intelligent. So we are the product of a ground intelligence. And then the hard problem of consciousness is so mysterious and so powerful that it is the fact of existence itself. Then you can start to get at something that would rationally be God itself. It would be the ground. And the problem with scientists and scientism is that they have these biases about what can and cannot exist from the start that themselves don't have any reason to stand on, right? Again, why does anything exist and not nothing? You can't answer that. You can only then go about asking what exists, but anything that exists is as unlikely as anything else. That doesn't mean that every crazy conception exists, though the conception of that crazy conception exists, right? You can imagine a flying spaghetti monster, but I'm not, just saying, well, we just, fairies and trolls and the whole thing. But go about finding the reason. Go about why are you denying that intelligence and a ground consciousness, a self with the capital S, to which all things owe their existence. Now I know, just people, that's word salad. I get it. But what science does is it denies the possibility of that from the start. But then it comes up against phenomenons that it can't explain. It cannot explain biological complexity and it cannot explain consciousness. The only thing that can explain biological complexity and consciousness is consciousness and intelligence as the ground from the start. And if we all had a scientific agreement on that being what we truly are, I just can only imagine how that would affect the ways that we could relate to each other and the meanings that we could find in life, as opposed to the inverse of that, which is meaninglessness and randomness.